three amazing architects tonight. Kevin, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everyone, for coming out to our latest and greatest History of American Architecture lecture series. This is the fourth in the series, and each year I try to bring something different to you all. And so in the past, we focused more on chronological studies. This year, we're looking at Cranbrook visitors. And what do I mean by that? Well, every week, I will talk about three architects who came to Cranbrook Academy of Art and spoke to students, spoke to the general public. And what I'm hoping to do with these vignettes is to paint a picture of 5 specific moments in time over the 5 weeks of the course. So instead of just having a linear history, I'm hoping to take us, and it's almost like we're going back in time and learning from these architects what they would have shared in each of their moments that they came to the academy. Now, in the early history, in these first weeks, I don't actually know what they said. I don't have transcriptions of their lectures, and I don't have recordings of what they spoke about. But what I do have is a copious amount of literature written about these architects and what was on their mind, what was sort of chief concerning them in each of the eras. And so each of the 5 weeks from the 1930s to the 2010s is going to have a different focus and look at 3 different architects. And tonight, we will be starting with 3 of the biggest names in the history of architecture: Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Alvar Aalto. As I mentioned, each week we will be focusing on 3 different architects. And so from Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Aalto, we'll end with Jeannie Gang, Greg Pasquarelli, and David Adage on the far right. And while an interesting way of organizing this study of American architecture could have been to look at the students at Cranbrook and what they were doing, I felt that that was getting a little bit too far into armchair psychology and reading into, oh, if Frank Lloyd Wright spoke here and then Ed Bacon designed something 20 years later, it must be attributed to that one lecture. So I'm not going to focus as much on the students who were studying at Cranbrook when these visitors came and lectured, and instead I'll focus on the careers and the buildings of the architects. As I mentioned, we'll be starting with these 3 gentlemen tonight. Born some 30 years apart, Frank Lloyd Wright in America, Le Corbusier in Switzerland, and Alvar Aalto in Finland. These are 3 architects who really shaped the discourse of modernism in the 20th century. Now, when you signed up, I hope you saw it was a history of American architect, and 2 of these are not Americans. But the 1930s were the beginning of sort of transcontinental conversations in architecture. And by the time of his death, Le Corbusier was very much an international architect. And Alvar Aalto, though heavily associated with Finland, he too was known for this sort of global design reach. Now, each of these gentlemen came and spoke at the Academy of Art in the 1930s. Frank Lloyd Wright gave formal lectures on 3 occasions. I'll be focusing on his first in April 1935. Le Corbusier came to America twice and only once for any length of time in October, November of 1935. And then Alvar Aalto gave 2 formal lectures at the Academy in 1938 and 1940. And each of the men are seen here with Cranbrook's first president and resident architect, head of Cranbrook's Department of Architecture and Town Planning, Eliel Saarinen. And in the 1930s, Cranbrook looked like this. What had been sort of farmland in the outskirts of Detroit was being transformed through the generosity and vision of our founders, ironworker and newspaper magnate George Booth and his wife Ellen Scripps Booth, into an estate where education, art, science, and religion would be furthered, would be studied. And though Cranbrook has many different parts to it, and if you're not familiar with the campus, it is a kind of confusing place. We're going to be focused tonight on just Cranbrook Academy of Art, a graduate school of art. And in the words of our first president, Eliel Saarinen, Cranbrook is not an art school in the ordinary meaning. It is a working place for creative art. The leading idea is to have artists live at Cranbrook and execute their work here. And so in the 1930s, when these visitors came and spoke at Cranbrook, they would have seen the students working across many different disciplines in art, design, and architecture. And they were working in the studios with master artisans, and it was a place of extraordinary experimentation and extraordinary productivity, this sort of country club of art here outside of Detroit. Leading the Department of Architecture was Eliel Saarinen, seen here with Cranbrook students in the 1940s. His own background was in painting and architecture, and he became to international prominence with a series of buildings in Finland, from his own house, Vitrask, on the top left, to apartment houses in the city center of Helsinki, to, on the bottom right, his sort of magnum opus of the Finnish years, the railway station in downtown Helsinki, to city halls in the southern Finland, and then at the top center, what preoccupied much of the latter half of his career, town planning. This a plan for a garden suburb outside of Helsinki. In 1922, he came in second in the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, and that launched his American career. And arriving at Cranbrook in 1925, he began designing Cranbrook School for Boys at the top, Kingswood School for Girls at the center, and his own house at the Academy of Art on the right. His career would transform again at Cranbrook with the later buildings like the Institute of Science and the Art Museum, which are very sort of noble Swedish classical buildings, this very sort of humanist modernism influenced by classical design. But he was always interested, particularly in the classroom, in planning. And tonight we're going to see that each of Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Alvar Aalto were really preoccupied with the dominant challenge of the 1930s, which was city planning and housing, what was sometimes called in the American press the small house problem. So students at Cranbrook were deeply enmeshed in planning problems. And I think that Frank Lloyd Wright would have very much appealed to these planners seen here when he showed up in April of 1935, particularly because he was working in his own sort of vision of town planning, which I will introduce in a moment. We see Eliel Saarinen on the left and Frank Lloyd Wright on the right, standing in front of the recently completed Kingswood School for Girls. And I like to picture that Frank Lloyd Wright is sort of covering the sun from his eye, looking at this building and saying, Mr. Saarinen, you certainly owe me quite a lot for the design of this structure, because Kingswood, with its hipped roofs, its low hugging design, spreading out across the prairie, the golden brick, it is a strong departure from Eliel Saarinen's earlier architecture, and it is this sort of European influenced version of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie style houses. These are the houses that Frank Lloyd Wright was famous for and that the students at Cranbrook would have known the master for. These extraordinarily luxurious, earth-hugging prairie-style houses like the Martin House in Buffalo. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Wisconsin. He is practicing in Chicago. And we see his own home and studio, which is a sort of variation on the American shingle style on the right. But like each of the architects I'll talk about tonight, Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't just start out a modernist, and some of his earliest works were revival styles, like this sort of Tudor Beathan Nathan Moore house in Oak Park. As he continues and he grows into his own confidence and career. We see houses like the Winslow House influenced by Turkish architecture, and especially the Japanese pavilion from the 1893 World's Fair. But his real revolution in design and planning comes with the Willits House, his sort of first great prairie style house, where the horizontal line is reinforced by unbroken eaves and outriding walls that enclose porches and gardens, and where internal spaces pinwheel around a central stair and chimney. But the cellular design of the Victorian home is being eliminated in favor of the open floor plan. And this was what European architects looked to and said, there is a genius. They admired Frank Lloyd Wright's materialization of architecture into these rooms that flowed one into the next. It is this sort of surprising redefinition of the room that he perfects for the next decade. And it comes to a crescendo in the Roby House, which sort of became the ideal image of the modern house with its open floor plan, its low hugging design for many years to come. Wright wasn't just building houses in this era. He was also doing commercial ventures like the administration building for the Larkin Company. Soap makers, it was led by the Martins of the Martin House. And before they built their Frank Lloyd Wright house, Darwin Martin built this administration building. From the outside, you have these strong columns that sort of erupt from the earth. They're holding all of the circulation, so the stairways, the elevator, but also all the mechanical systems. And so Wright is thinking about how the machine is entering his architecture in plumbing and wiring and telephone. And then on the inside, it is this great atrium space. And Frank Lloyd Wright didn't invent the atrium, but he certainly gave it its modern form. In particular, this egalitarian bent of all of the ladies who are sorting catalog orders, having this great open space underneath the skylit underneath the skylight, which is ringed by sort of transcendentalist quotes inspiring the worker there on the floor and around the balconies. When Frank Lloyd Wright goes to present this building, he uses both photographs, but also presentation drawings. And so this is a drawing done after the building's constructed for the famed Wasmuth portfolio. Published in Berlin, this is the portfolio that would introduce many European architects, including Le Corbusier, to Frank Lloyd Wright. But something strange happens over time. And so if we're thinking about Wright's 1935 visit to Cranbrook, what would the students have known of Wright? It's less likely they would have known this drawing, but they would know the Larkin building through this drawing, which is a bit of a historical recreation by Frank Lloyd Wright, as he is fighting sort of emerging European modernism and saying, well, I did it first. He begins to redraw some of his buildings from the 1890s and 1900s in this more modern style. And so you see the way that instead of using just simple line work, he's now using planes, these black planes. And this element here in the front that sort of sticks out to me as being extraordinarily odd. It looks almost like a steel frame construction floating in front of the building, as if he is mirroring the Russian constructivist of that same era. Of course, there is no sort of steel frame structure outside the Larkin building. That is simply the way he's chosen to draw the fence. So he's attempting to beat the Europeans at their own game, and he is reintroducing this earlier work to a new audience with a publication on modern architecture of a series of lectures he had delivered at Princeton. He was also promoting his work in concrete, like the Unity Temple of 1908, one of the US's first exposed cast concrete structure. And modernists, they do love their concrete. And so as we look at this sort of organic style, botanic, inspired by nature, cast concrete architecture, it is almost like a tomb from the outside, and yet on the inside, it is this glorious sun-drenched golden interior, where in this sort of Unitarian tradition, everyone is co-equal. They're not facing the altar, they're facing each other. And he's really relying on Japanese architecture, on Austrian modernism, and he is synthesizing these together into a uniquely American style. Now, the Unity Temple and the Larkin Building will be real markers of his early career, and that is what people would have known him for in the 1930s. But those buildings were 20 years old. Frank Lloyd Wright's career took quite a hit when he ran off with a client's wife, leaving his own wife and 6 children. He escapes to Italy and then Japan, where he builds the Imperial Hotel. He attempts to relaunch his career in Los Angeles, building the Barnsdall House and La Miniatura and 4 other textile block houses. These are houses on the left made out of cast concrete block woven together. It's a good question how many Cranbrook students would have known about these houses from the 1920s. They were not really celebrated in the popular press, though they were well documented. He was Frank Lloyd Wright, but these did not have the sort of impact that I think he wanted. And so he retreats back to Wisconsin, where he rebuilds his house Taliesin. Of course, this is not the time nor place to get into the personal travails of Frank Lloyd Wright, though there are many, particularly tragic, the 1920 fire and murder of his partner, Mama Borthwick, and her children, and the loss of really the love of his life. And so the 1920s and 30s really become this sort of wasteland, both personal and professional, to Frank Lloyd Wright. Between 1928 and 1935, he only has 2 building commissions. So what is he doing as an architect with no commissions? Turning himself into a celebrity. He marries his 3rd wife, Olga Vana, in 1928. He begins working out of the Arizona desert in the winters, and he also begins publishing profusely, traveling constantly around the United States from coast to coast, lecturing on architecture at museums and universities. He acquired a reputation, and then he sort of encouraged that reputation for visiting a city, ridiculing its architecture, and then promising that he was the only one who could solve their ills. And as he turns himself into a celebrity and media star, it's a real sort of calculated sense of public flamboyance that helped to attract clients, but also apprentices. 1932 is a pivotal year in the story of American architecture because Philip Johnson and Alfred Barr host the Museum of Modern Art's International Modern Show. It's where we get the term International Modernism, and it's where American audiences are introduced to designers like the Bauhaus's Walter Gropius, Germany's Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier, who I'll discuss in a moment, his Villa Savoye seen here. Frank Lloyd Wright was in this show. The show traveled from New York to 14 other venues over 2 years, introducing through its books and exhibitions, photographs, and models, a certain way of being modern. And it wasn't really this way. So here we see Frank Lloyd Wright's colored pencil drawing of a speculative house that he designed for the show. Remember, he had no actual work that would have been recent for an exhibit in 1932. So he designs this house specifically for the Museum of Modern Art. But when he builds the model, you'll see that it's much more European, much more flat. He's sort of abandoning that organic architecture, and he is sort of transforming, much the way he did the Larkin building with the drawing, into this more streamlined international modernist architect. Of course, his projects in actuality would never do the sort of transformation he can do on paper art with a model. As the show at MoMA is going on, Frank Lloyd Wright is busy setting up his apprenticeship. It was a residential group of student architects who paid over $1,000 annually to live, work, farm, and generally entertain Frank and Olga Vana. It cost more than going to Harvard, and they were doing his work and paying him to do it. It was a huge success and had a huge influence on American architecture. In particular, a speculative project funded by Edgar Kaufman Jr., one of his apprentices, for the Broadacre city. They started this model of an idealized American city in November of 1934, and the apprentices worked constantly in the Arizona desert, building tiny buildings, tiny trees, tiny stadia, and skyscrapers in advance of boxing it up and shipping it to Rockefeller Center. It was there in April 14th, 1935, that Frank Lloyd Wright presented Broadacre City to the world. You see his house on the mesa in the back of the photograph, and then Frank Lloyd Wright overseeing his vision of American landscape. And it is a decentralized plan where, building off of Thomas Jefferson's agrarian grid, he gives every American 3 to 5 acres of land, a little pinwheel-shaped house, enough land to farm, and then city centers have become entirely decentralized, and you have towers for bachelors or students or elderly, you have centers of sport and recreation, you have shopping and religion, but none of it is sort of in a downtown, and it's all connected by trains, planes, automobiles, and helicopters. It was his vision of America, largely has come true, though in a much less graceful way than Broadacre City. And he begins promoting this model and his thoughts in new lectures. So 11 days after this is debuted at Rockefeller Center, we see Frank Lloyd Wright walking alongside Eliel Saarinen at Kingswood. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright famously, and the story is recorded in multiple places, different ways, but he looks around at Eliel's buildings and he sort of says, "I'm so glad I've come to Cranbrook. I'm reminded what a great architect I am." And Eliel Saarinen looks back and says, "Sir, you are often frank, but rarely right." So they had this sort of professional rivalry, but I think a close personal friendship that's reflected in the amount of times that Wright came to visit the Saarinens and the times he met up with them in New York and Wisconsin. But on this occasion, he was here for a public lecture that was hyped in all of the local papers. And we see him at Kingswood. We see him with Eliel here at the Academy of Art. And then that evening, the lecture was held in the Cranbrook Pavilion. Here is the invitation to that lecture. And what I know about this talk comes from a diary of a neighbor, Kate Thompson Bromley, who was a dedicated diarist, and her records are down at the Bentley Historical Collection. And she talks about the thrill of having Frank Lloyd Wright in Bloomfield Hills, the packed audience, and what she records being his lesson of work, 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 and when you're tired, work. I know from other lectures that Frank Lloyd Wright delivered around this time, he also would have been talking about what America lacked in culture. And he would have been calling for an organic architecture that fought against European influences and attacked eclecticism and imitation in architecture. In the Cranbrook Pavilion, designed by Albert Kahn in 1923 and enclosed by Saarinen in 1934, he would have been also promoting a topic that was greatly on his mind in the mid-30s, which was the art and craft of the machine. And Cranbrook, of course, is fully immersed in the arts and crafts movement, which was a 19th century English movement that rejected industrial fabrication in favor of handicraft. And Frank Lloyd Wright is attempting to do something William Morris refused to do, which was incorporate machines into the arts and crafts. And Frank Lloyd Wright told an audience at Princeton that the machine is a marvelous simplifier, the emancipator of the creative mind, and in time, the regenerator of creative conscience. And Frank Lloyd Wright praised modern technology like plastics, lithographs, concrete, and all of the sort of potential of the machine in creating the Broadacre city. Because as he said, or as he wrote rather, without the interest and cooperation of American manufacturers, our society cannot begin to do its work, for this is the cornerstone of our organization. So he wasn't a sort of Luddite. He was very much thinking, what can Detroit do for Broadacre City? Now, when Frank Lloyd Wright is here in April of 35, he's built practically nothing of note. But when he returns in January of 36 and April of 37, his career is on an upswing that will last until his death at the age of 93 in 1959, with projects like his first Usonian house, one of these Broadacre city houses, the Jacobs House, and the headquarters of Johnson Wax. But most famously, and what I think the students at Cranbrook and the public would have been most thrilled about, was the completion in 1936 of Falling Water. And I'll just take a moment to sort of walk us through the house. Built by the Pittsburgh department store magnate Edgar Kaufman Jr., this is the view of Falling Water that Frank Lloyd Wright designs, but the client never appreciated or never saw, because you actually approach the house from the other side. You wander through the woods, you see it across Bear Run, you go across this little bridge, and you see these floating concrete trays that seem to be miraculously held out over the water by this great stone edifice. And then as you turn the corner, you see the front door is just this sort of crack in between these rough stone walls, quarried nearby. And look at the way the house is physically linked to the mountain. It is one with nature, with these concrete trellis that is reaching out and connecting the sort of fern-covered stone with the stone of Wright's building. We slip in through this low door into the living room, a slate floor polished with, of course, Johnson wax. So it's looking wet. You can hear the water, and we see the living room with its furs and pillows. And this is looking out towards the waterfall. And if you go onto the porch, you look straight down and you just realize the sort of precariousness of the entire enterprise. But you can become further connected to the water by walking down this hatch that seems like something come off of an ocean liner. And you walk down these stairs, and Frank Lloyd Wright actually wanted this to be floating above the water. It structurally ended up being reinforced, but you have this real sort of connection between his house, the architecture, and the nature on which it is built. The further closer to the mountain you get, the darker the home is, and it has this real sort of sensuality to it as you work your way upstairs into the offices and bedrooms, and these famous corner windows which open up and completely dematerialize so that the house has no corners. And that even happens for the non-operable windows, where you see he's running 2 sheets of plate glass together with no corner beam. It is really like being in a treehouse as much as it is to be in a house. It is America's most sublime work of architecture. And when we have the chance to get there, it is an absolute must-see for each and every one of you. And there's a lot of this that you can sort of say, how much is he looking at the European modernist and directly responding to it? He's looking at buildings like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, and he's saying, oh, you want flat roofs, you want concrete, you want trays? Well, I'll do it, and I'll do it better. And he had this real antagonistic relation with our second Cranbrook visitor. Le Corbusier became famous to American audiences around 1927 with the publication of his seminal text, Towards a New Architecture, or more correctly, the more recent translation, Toward an Architecture. And this book scandalized the French society, it scandalized architects, because a title like Towards an Architecture implies there is no architecture. And Le Corbusier really was this, I think, deep nihilist at his core, or at least sort of acting one on the world stage. And he talks about the necessity for architecture to progress in the same way that he sees 2 Greek temples. On the left, an earlier temple, on the right, the Parthenon, the greatest work of Greek classical architecture. In the same way, the machine has progressed from the car of 1907 to 1921. And making this comparison that architecture and machine could be comparable was really a revolution. And so in Towards a New Architecture, which Frank Lloyd Wright says there's nothing new about it, it's all fashion over substance, Le Corbusier is looking towards Greece and Rome, and then proposing something wildly different. Now, as a young man, he had visited the Acropolis, and he was enamored with the idea of the Acropolis as being an architecture of progression. And so in this sketch, you see him sitting in Athens, illustrating how one progresses like a pilgrim through the various courts and temples up to the Parthenon at the top of the Acropolis. Or at Hadrian's villa, where a young Le Corbusier illustrates the dining room of Hadrian's villa, looking out, framed this sort of view, which Frank Brown, the American archaeologist, used to say Hadrian's villa is so sited so as to be the first place where, if you stand on your tiptoes, you can barely not see Rome. And this allusion was taught to me by Vincent Scully, and it's something that Le Corbusier takes into his architecture. These ideas of vistas, these ideas of not of progression and of moving through architecture. And he scandalizes French society when he proposes a city for 3 million inhabitants, where at the center of the city, framed in these glass towers, is a landing strip where these sort of suicide mission biplanes come soaring in, land on top of this parking structure and superhighways, and just the sort of modernity of it all. And as you move out from the city of 3 million, the city of business, which are these towers in the park at the center, gives way to the city of living in these sort of large apartment blocks. And what would it be like to be a pedestrian? Well, first of all, I'm not sure Le Corbusier is that concerned with that, but he does do some watercolors where he shows this park-like setting where the city is no longer a crowded, dense place, but instead is an open place full of light and air. And those apartment blocks he envisions as being towers where everyone gets a hanging garden and everyone has a sort of villa in the sky with 2-story living rooms full of light and air. And this design is coming out of his Citroën house, named after the French automaker. It was his prototypical house, where in the front of the house you have a 2-story living room, behind it you have a first-floor kitchen, and above that the bedroom. And it is part of this sort of functionalist movement in architecture, where the machine is dictating exactly how to design and how to live. As he wrote in towards an architecture, a house is a machine for living in. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright had said that the machine was a way of increasing the beauty of our sort of art and craft, that the machine would be an emancipator of creativity. Le Corbusier is proposing that instead the machine is the architecture, and that we need to bring architecture further into sort of automation and mass production. His real scandal, though, is the Plan Voisin, proposed at the Art Deco show of 1925. It proposed eliminating downtown Paris in favor of towers in a park. So here you see the Louvre Museum and Palace. Here you see Notre Dame. And then he has raised the entire center of Paris. And this collage that he makes is to scale. So you see the density of existing Paris, and then on the left, the density of his towers in the park. It is this deeply Nietzschean vision of the city and of the future that you think that could never possibly be realized. And the sort of populace rejects this idea outright. I mean, it was a speculative proposal in the first place. But as horrifying as this is, it becomes quite popular in America in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s particularly. And you see St. Louis and its urban renewal, where they have eliminated blocks of historic cast iron buildings and warehouses. And just as Le Corbusier would have saved Notre Dame and the Louvre, St. Louis has saved its historic cathedral and some of its historic architecture, but otherwise created a place for a new city. Eventually, Eero Saarinen's great arch would be built on this site. But you also see the tower in the park concept realized in places like Co-op City in the Bronx, and even Lafayette Park here in Detroit, where where Mies van der Rohe builds a park-like setting of glass towers and townhouses on top of the historic city district. And it is this act of God that really makes Le Corbusier into this sort of totalitarian figure. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the architect, where he has staged this sort of disembodied hand. It is all about the architect as sort of total designer, as the God figure who is sort of introducing this city of the future, this functionalist city. It is a deeply unsettling vision to me, but it is something that Le Corbusier would be interested in for his entire career. And we compare that to the much more sort of humanist Frank Lloyd Wright, who in an equally staged publicity photo is seen with his sort of workman's, the well-tailored wool coat. He has his beret, and he is this sort of American figure of the sort of frontiersman projecting onto the American landscape his vision of the city. Now, the Plan Voisin was introduced, as I mentioned, at the 1925 Art Deco show. And if you've never heard of Le Corbusier's contributions to the Art Deco show, which is much more famous for giving us the Art Deco style, it's because they put him really in the back of the crowd. It was hard to get to. Even the director of the Museum of Modern Art did not know it was there when he visited. So it didn't have so much of an impact in person as it did later in photographs. And you can see my pointer is highlighting the exhibition building that this was sort of squeezed behind. Now, the Plan Voisin was on display in that room on the left of the house, and then the house was a showcase of Le Corbusier's architecture. And it was built ostensibly by the magazine that he had established in 1920, which was a way of covering the arts, cinema, architecture, design, science, psychoanalyst. It was the New Spirit magazine, was this sort of radical promotion of French thought. And it promoted things like Le Corbusier's theories, but also his paintings and other painters of the Purism movement, which sought to sort of purify France and make a sort of tougher, more puritanical French culture in order to sort of stand up to the Germans. There's so much of Le Corbusier that is sort of deeply disturbing to us today in his thoughts of totalitarianism and purism in painting. But the pavilion, which was again sort of rejected by the French public, displayed functionalism at its height, where you have this luxurious two-story living room, in the back repurposed file cabinets, and then simple furniture, minimalist decorations, no sort of clutter within this perfect house. And so this rendition of the machine for living room, or machine for living, is the sort of ultimate development of earlier thoughts that Le Corbusier had had as early as 1914, when he designed the Domino House, which was exploiting concrete to create a house where all of the walls and rooms were completely separate from the structure. And so you see this influencing American architects almost immediately after it's published in Toward an Architecture, with architects like Rudolf Schindler, the Austrian emigre, working in Southern California, building essentially a Citroën house, and even Frank Lloyd Wright building what is a concrete block Citroën house, where you have a first floor that's parking and workspaces, and then a double height living room in the front, and in the back, a first floor kitchen, and then bedroom above. But how did this one name architect even come about? He couldn't have been born a sort of renegade Nietzschean revolutionary. In fact, he also came out of a arts and crafts tradition. Born to a artistic mother and a watchmaker father, he studied not architecture, but watch decorating in his town in the French-speaking section of Switzerland. And his earliest architecture is influenced as much by Owen Jones and William Morris as by any sort of modernist, where he's adapting the vernacular forms of Swiss chalets into this regional variation of the arts and crafts movement. He travels around after building this house in 1907. He travels through Germany, France, and Italy, and he comes back and he begins building sort of garden suburb style houses, looking like something that could come from the English architect Voici, and at home in any sort of garden suburb, or even at home in Chicago. And he's clearly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he credits the Winslow House, which had been published in German magazines, as being an influence on his parents' house. But by 1916, his villas are taking on this more abstract form. And so his quote unquote Turkish villa is built out of reinforced concrete, a new modern material, and it is modeled on these more abstract shapes. And on the inside, we see his first double height living space, here in a much more decorative and plastic form. And 1916 marks a turning point. This is his last project in Switzerland as he's practicing in Switzerland. He moves to France in 1917. He adopts the nomenclature Le Corbusier, a modified version of his grandfather's first name, and he never again goes back towards history. Instead, we get to the machines for living, like this artist house in Paris, our artist studio, where you see that Frank Lloyd Wright, where the fireplace had been so central, now the fireplace is almost ancillary. It's this tiny little fireplace in the corner. Instead, it's all about this wall of steel glass, factory windows. There's this sort of ladder, this stairway that's inspired by ship architecture, ocean liner design, leading up to a tiny little library, simple chair by Thonet, which he called the sort of knapsack of chairs where you could just sort of take it. It was useful, it was functional. And we compare this to a living room by Frank Lloyd Wright. And if Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to sort of build up the family, surround them by the hearth. Le Corbusier is not building an architecture for the family at all. His is very much this sort of young, youthful, work-focused architecture. And Wright was sort of reading Freud and then trying to weave together the family through his architecture. Le Corbusier is following Nietzsche and Marx, where the children would be brought up by the state. And so he has this sort of violent, impatient architecture. He does build family homes. Of course, all of this sort of revolutionary design. So he's essentially building luxury houses. And so we have here a house for a doctor where you slip in through that black door, you come into a double height space where the walls seem to be made of paper. The structure is not evident. It is a timber and masonry building. You go up the stairs, you cross the bridge, and you go into the gallery where you then walk the length of the gallery and you go up the ramp and you've reached the sort of top of the Acropolis looking out into Paris. And we see that interest that he had in processional architecture reflected in the single home. Shortly after this, he builds for the Deutsche Werkbund, which was a German society of arts and crafts and later modernism, two houses in an ideal German suburb outside of Stuttgart. One on the left, a citron house, on the right, a attached home. And the success among architects was not reflected by the general public, who found these buildings bizarre and unattractive. But for Le Corbusier, these two structures clarify his new 5 points for a new architecture. His architecture from this point on will be raised on pilotis, or columns. It will feature free plans, free facades, windows at human scales, and roof gardens. And this is the way to a new functionalist architecture, as exhibited in the home for Gertrude Stein's brother, where you see Le Corbusier has parked the car quite intentionally in front of this very flat house. And as we walk up to the house, you see this flat facade, all white, ribbon windows, and then you go inside and you have all abstraction, all sort of functional living. Le Corbusier said that this house was an exquisite apparition in which poetry, technology, biology, and human scale are united. But the house which the Cranbrook students who saw Le Corbusier's lecture in 1935 would have probably been most excited about would have been the Villa Savoy, finished in shortly after the Villa Stein. You drive up to the house along the driveway, you park your car underneath the pilotis, you walk into this sort of glass enclosure where you're faced with two circulation options, a ramp that will go all the way to the roof of the house, and then a stairway that is sort of worming its way up. The living room then is defined again by the pilotis, which have raised the second floor. And then as you turn out of the living room, you see the way that he has captured the ribbon windows on interior and exterior space. We turn again towards the bedrooms, seeing the ramp and the stairway. And then he gives this sort of very luxurious bathroom where you have a chaise lounge built in glass tile, and then the bathtub sunk down below. It is meant for indoor-outdoor living, and so you see the way the living room and the balcony are related to each other. We'll walk up this ramp towards this window, where here, just like at Hadrian's Villa, we're now just high enough to be able to stand on our tiptoes and not see Paris. But what else is he looking out from the roof here? I think he's sort of looking towards America. And it's at this point that Le Corbusier begins to become deeply invested with getting to America and seeing the country that he had really been obsessed with since the 19 teens, going so far as to send his mother a postcard saying he was boarding a ship to travel to America in 1909. He actually sent it from his house. He was just sort of play acting his first trip to America. But there was really no European architect who had written as passionately about American skyscrapers, factories, landscapes, city plans, and machine age modernity as Corbusier. He knew America through American clients and associates, through travel accounts, through literature and film, pop culture, and advertisements. But he set sail on the SS Normandy to finally see it in person in October of 1920 or 1935. He learned some English words on the Normandy, but he learned it from the American surrealist Abraham Ratner, so he only had a sort of eclectic amount of phrases like, "Oh gee, you're swell," and "you're a lousy dope." And so he was speaking mostly in French. And when he arrived in New York Harbor, he was deeply insulted that there was no press to greet the famed Frenchman. He gave a lecture at the Museum of Modern Art the night he arrived, where he then insulted New York by saying the skyscrapers were small. And he spent the next 2 months giving 21 lectures in 15 cities, from Maine to Maryland, New York to Wisconsin. He gave lectures on 3 themes: the radiant city, his city plans, his great works, the houses that I've just shown you, and on the Neoplatonic, or the theory of pure forms. He had a translator who traveled with him, Robert Allen Jacobs, and the translator had worked for Corbusier in France. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, Corbusier had no sort of fellowship, and so his associates were sort of in and out. And Jacobs, though his translator, actually spoke terrible French. And so at the beginning of the lectures, he would tell the audience, the master will speak in French, and anyone who understands, you should leave immediately after, and I'll translate for anyone who misses anything. And of course, no one wants to be embarrassed and actually stick around and say you don't know French. And so he got away with rarely actually translating the lectures. Now, Le Corbusier arrived in Detroit on November 20th, 1935. By this point, he had spent a month in Manhattan. He had insulted New York. He had insulted Philadelphia. He had insulted pretty much everyone. And he got to Detroit, and the word of his being offended by the arrival with no press had gotten to Detroit. And so he is greeted, this photograph is taken by an entire press corps of reporters and photographers. And he described it as being a modern day prophet arriving in Detroit. Now, what he couldn't know was that that press wasn't there because they heard he was coming. They were there on the direct instructions from the publisher of the Detroit News, George Booth, also known as the founder of Cranbrook. He gets to Detroit, and he immediately demands to be taken to the Ford plant, where he says that the future of architecture will be created by industry. And he writes that he's plunged into a kind of stupor by Henry Ford's Rouge plant, where a car every 45 seconds, 6,000 a day, confirmed to him the belief that housing must come entirely from new industrial processes. Le Corbusier thought that there needed to be a combination of American technique and European wisdom. His next stop is to Cranbrook, where he arrives for his lecture that evening. Ahead of him, a small exhibit organized by the Museum of Modern Art was on display at Cranbrook, featuring movies, a model, 24 enlarged photographs, and 14 building plans. The public again crammed into the cast concrete Cranbrook Pavilion, designed by Albert Kahn, and Albert Kahn was the architect who introduced Le Corbusier. The interpreter found it a little bit ironic that Albert Kahn, who was Henry Ford's architect, who had built the Ford plant, also built Cranbrook House, here was this great American industrial architect leading a 600-man firm, building millions of square feet of buildings all around the world. And Kahn was saying Le Corbusier was the greatest architect in the world, when Le Corbusier had built essentially nothing relative to Albert Kahn, nothing on that scale. During the lecture, Corbusier would use drawing paper that would be pinned up to the wall, and he would use chalks and pastels to illustrate the points of his architectural theory. This is a drawing he did at Bowdoin College in Maine, shortly before the Cranbrook lecture. And here is a drawing he did during the Cranbrook lecture. It was considered to be the most impassioned of his tour, where after visiting Ford in the morning, Le Corbusier came to Cranbrook and declared that his radiant city required methods of production and modern techniques combined for social ends to fulfill the essential needs of man. And what he's illustrating in this drawing are the opposing forces of A, going up, individual liberty, and B, going down, collective forces, and then C, going to the left, the moribund academies, so architecture schools that relied on history and Beaux-Arts planning. In order to make progress and pull architecture forward into the future, we would need a combination of biological, economic, political, and technical revolutions to support the rights of the individual and the collective needs of society. After this sort of diatribe of a lecture, Cranbrook's founder, George Booth, came up and shook the great Frenchman's hand and sadly said, "But art, sir, what do you do about art?" And Le Corbusier, I think, found George Booth rather provincial. He would heavily criticize Cranbrook in his later book about America, calling Cranbrook cut off from life here in the fiefdom of Ford. Cranbrook is simply a paradisic retreat for disheartened combatants of capitalism. He compared it to Princeton and Vassar that he had seen on his trip. Cranbrook was a monkery. Now, if you compare our first two visitors, Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, and just compare the body language, Eliel, Saarinen, and Wright looking sort of like friends, relaxed, Le Corbusier and Saarinen quite close, not even looking at the same direction of the camera. I think Le Corbusier, though his lecture was a success, his theories were not as well received, perhaps by the general public, though I'm sure the students were, as they were at so many of his lectures, enthralled. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier never met, though they were both in Madison, Wisconsin on the occasion of Corbu's lecture there. Le Corbusier said, "I don't want to have to shake that man's hand." So they had some baggage between the two. And Le Corbusier would be entirely disillusioned by America from his trip. He got no clients, which was one of his great purposes in coming on the trip. And in 1947, he published the English language edition of When Cathedrals Were White, Voyage to the Land of the Timid. By this point, though, the late 30s and 40s, the dogmatic functionalism and purism and the machine for living, it was becoming passé, and it was becoming to be questioned as the very idea of an international architecture was becoming less palatable. In America, international architecture became associated with Soviet architecture. And in general, in Western Europe, critics were sort of advising designers to get rid of foreign influence and turn toward towards native developments. And this, of course, is the lead up to the horrors of World War II and the catastrophe of the nation state in that conflict. But you see architecture, which had been this sort of universal collaboration, leaning into identities and architects associated more with individual countries. And other than Frank Lloyd Wright as American, there is no European more associated with his country than our final visitor tonight, Alvar Aalto, who came to Cranbrook to visit the architecture students in 1938 and who lectured here in 1940 and 1945. As Le Corbusier was returning from his visit to Cranbrook, Aalto was starting his rise to fame. And his prominence on the international field is launched by the Paris show of 1937, where the Finnish pavilion was praised by Le Corbusier as a delight for its deep-rooted authenticity. And it was praised by the Museum of Modern Art, who almost immediately upon seeing the work of this Finnish architect, invited Aalto to America to do an exhibit there. Now, Aalto came from Finland. He had studied at the Helsinki Institute of Technology, the same school Eliel Saarinen had studied with. And Aalto's main teacher was actually Eliel Saarinen's partner from the 1890s and 1900s. Aalto's modernism came from trips through Denmark and Sweden in the 1920s, where he met people like Gunnar Asplund, and from trips to France and Germany, where he met Le Corbusier, Siegfried Givian, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and other leading continental European architects. Now, it was at the Paris show where the Savoy vase, designed for a restaurant, met its public debut, and Aalto considered it quite a success because all were stolen out of the pavilion. And when it came to what he would display on his Museum of Modern Art exhibit, he had a fairly short run of buildings that he would have considered to be worth sharing. Those included the structural concrete newspaper offices in Turku, which had this wonderful idea at the front where a curtain would be projected with the daily news to the sidewalk, and which on the back had this factory where you see these very sculptural columns supporting the machinery of the newspaper. And it was a far cry from his earlier work in Nordic classicism, which he had done earlier under this idea of sort of Scandinavian classicism and associating Finland with Western Europe. He would abandon that in favor of more international modernism at the Vapuri Library in Karelia, a part of Finland that was conquered by the Russians, liberated by the Finns, conquered by the Russian. It's still Russian today, where he and his wife, Aino, designed this beautiful library. Aino designed the stair hall, an auditorium with this undulating wooden roof, this sort of curve that Le Corbusier could never bring himself to put in a building. And then look at all of the wood, bent wooden furniture, and then also textiles and metals. We're losing the sort of machine and we're gaining sort of human touches in organic designs. At the same time, it has this sort of classical proportions, and he's very much looking towards Gunnar Asplund and his Stockholm library with the reading room and this sort of tiered level of books. But it was the Paimo Sanatorium, a tuberculosis sanatorium, that really made Aalto's name. And this was 30 miles outside of Turku. And it was a revolutionary building in Finland, its first great work of modern concrete architecture. And if we look at this fin coming off the back of the building, it is just porches for the tuberculosis patients to sit and take in fresh air. And then the rooms, the patient rooms, are along this side. To actually enter the building, you come in and you see all of the sort of factories and nursing stations, the commissary for the workers on one side, and then the entrance is here and the patients are along the right side. He's slipping us in with original colored awnings, color in architecture, what a great idea, and through into this sort of lake-shaped cover. And then you step inside and Alvar and Aino design everything, the light fixtures, the furnishings, the color schemes, even the patient sinks. And so he designs a chair particularly to clear the lungs for tuberculosis patients, the famous Paimo chair, which is made of plywood, a very modern material, within bent birch legs. And even the cheeriness of the hospital is meant to help in the recuperation of the patients. So this rubber floor from the Nokia company of cell phone fame a little bit later, or rubber ceilings in the dining room, which also have these sort of golden domes. Then the patient corridors are brightly colored and brightly lit with windows running along one side and a very Corbusian ribbon window. And then in the patient rooms, he designs all the furniture and sinks after deep study into what convalescence for tuberculosis was like, even down to designing door handles that were meant to not be caught on the doctor's coat as they exited the room. But that famous wing of the building is this sort of great structural expression. We see Aalto standing on top of it, and then here we see some of the patients laying along the building. And the completion of this project really marks Aalto's appearance as the leading Finnish architect. And he's taking that position over from Eliel Saarinen. And Eliel Saarinen had been Finland's most famous architect since the 1890s. Aalto had been interested in him since he saw buildings by Saarinen in a newspaper at the age of 9. But Aalto's Finnish modernism is distinctly different from Eliel's, and associated with his architecture is his and his wife's designs for furniture and the Artek company, which they launched in 1935. And in 1936, the couple moved from central Finland to Helsinki to be closer to the sort of international markets. And so he designs his house very blank on the outside, very warm on the inside. And on the outside, it has this sort of wooden corner that really marks a change from Le Corbusier's machine for living into this more human modernism. And even in his studio, we see this eclectic mixture of materials and forms in this very sort of personal, warm space. The house that I think the architecture students at Cranbrook would have been most excited to talk to Alvar Aalto about, though, was the Villa Maria. And this was built for the heir to the Alstrom company. She collected art, and she was quite continental and modernist. Her husband was less so a modernist, but was willing to go along with this great young visionary architect. And it's situated in a pine forest. And as you get closer, even the entrance to the house is mirroring the sort of pine forest around it. The house doesn't have the sort of machine-like logic of Le Corbusier. It is more eclectic and varied. And even as we get to the door with its custom doorknob, you see he's using unfinished wooden posts to actually support this awning. You step inside and you're greeted by yet another forest, the forest of stair post, and you turn, and inspired by falling water, he designs the living room and other spaces to flow like trays, one after the other. And he takes the Corbusier's pilotis, or the columns, and he wraps them in rattan. And then he takes Frank Lloyd Wright's hearth, the center of a home for Wright's imagination, and he turns it into a sculpture with this sort of negative relief, this lake form. He adds onto the side of the house a conservatory that is deeply indebted to the Japanese architecture he learned about in a gift of Japanese architectural books from the Japanese ambassador's wife who lived nearby. Atop the conservatory, this wooden box holds the studio for Mrs. Alstrom, and she has this working artist studio with this sort of stairway that's quite reminiscent to Le Corbusier's stairway. But if Le Corbusier's stairway was coming from an ocean liner and the sort of speed of machinery, I get the sense that Aalto's is coming more from the sort of dock of a rowboat. It's a much more, I think, human interpretation of the ship-like stair. And out back in a sort of Japanese Finnish garden, Aalto gives birth to the amoeba-shaped swimming pool that will revolutionize California design and skateboarding much later. Here is our first great lake-shaped swimming pool, and it's connected to the house with this covered terrace that links to a very Japanese-inspired sauna. So coming off of the success of the World's Fair in Paris, knowing that he has that exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, he enters into a competition to design the 1939 New York World's Fair Finnish Pavilion. And this building, which Frank Lloyd Wright said was the work of a sure genius, really introduces him to American audiences. Like all World's Fair, it's sort of full of Finnish propaganda, art and culture, science, sport, and it is arranged on these wooden baffles that have this lake-like shape within photos and films projected onto it. It sits opposite a restaurant, and the entire thing is cooled by these propellers up above. Finland was known for its propeller making industry. And it was on this trip to America where Aalto meets some of his American friends from Europe, like Alexander Calder and Philip Johnson, who he already knew. He meets Frank Lloyd Wright on this trip, and he even so admires Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin that Aalto writes to Frank Lloyd Wright asking if his son can come and study at Taliesin. The purpose of the trip was sort of twofold. One was to oversee the installation of his two exhibits, and the other was to promote Finland's role and Finland's sense of the republic, which was so under threat by the Russian impending invasion of the Winter War. And if you don't know all about Finnish history, it's one of great oppression and sort of horrible wars going back and forth, and they're about to enter one. And so as much as he is promoting his own furniture and his architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, he's also promoting for the Rockefeller Foundation the idea of an American town in Finland. And in his lectures in America, he is promoting this sort of humanist view of modernism that looks to the needs of housing not as a sort of social good, but as a way of housing a people who have been displaced and dislocated, and the need for American values to enter into the Finnish Republic through architecture and town planning. Now, Americans were never quite sure about Finnish political affinities, and rightly so. It gets confusing. And so this sort of one-man propaganda machine does travel across the US lecturing, but he's rather unsuccessful in getting funding. His journey through America is really less of one as a tourist or traveler, the sort of astute observer that Le Corbusier had been, but instead he's a complex, multi-dimensional architect, propagandist, advocate, and a sort of enjoyer of life. He had loved Buffalo Bill as a kid, and so he wants to go to the American West. His lectures that he delivers at various schools around the country and at Cranbrook are entitled The Humanizing of Architecture. And he argued for expanding modernism and expanding individual creativity and the human psyche. And in 1945, he is on another trip to America, again looking for work, looking for advocating for the Finnish causes, when he visits again the Saarinens at Cranbrook. And at this point, Eliel Saarinen invites Aalto to move to Bloomfield Hills, to become associated with Cranbrook, to become associated with his professional office. At the same time, Harvard is inviting Aalto to come to be its leader alongside Gropius. And Aalto is interested in these positions. At the same time, he's still enjoying American culture. Forgot to go to the next slide. Le Corbusier, I'm not sure how he felt about roadside attractions, but Aalto seemed to love them based on his photos. But Aalto has a position as first a research fellow and then as a faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he ends up not coming to Cranbrook, but staying at MIT, where he would teach students to throw away their T-square. He didn't enjoy talking about architecture as much as he talked about life, and he wasn't a sort of utopian visionary so much as he was a realist. And what could he do on the ground? His idea was to do it through the drawing of beautiful lines and the cultivation of the eye towards form. And he does that in his largest American project, the Baker Dormitories at MIT, where alongside the Charles River, he builds this serpentine brick building where every student is given a view at an angle to this very busy road that is running back and forth. And so he's romanticizing the sort of traffic of the machine, and he's enclosing the students in this rough brick. And this is his first great brick building, and it's built of the same brick that Cranbrook is built out of. And you see the sort of influence of Saarinen on Aalto. And he's thinking, should I move my children? Should I bring my wife here? When tragically in 1949, Aino dies of cancer, and he wins two great competitions. And so these two projects bring him back to Finland, and he'll never again sort of come to America with the same frequency. And his later work is really a continuation of the principles of organic architecture, of humanizing modernism, of being a sort of regional architect in touch with the world and with the woods. And so his buildings here for a small company town on an island in Finland, where instead of a sort of magnificent tower, he builds the council chambers up on a hill, and he allows simply the roof to be the sort of icon of this town. And you get there by going up these grass steps. Or for his and Saarinen's alma mater, the Institute of Technology, he builds, after their campus was destroyed by the Russians in Helsinki, he builds Finland's first great American-style college campus in the suburbs of Helsinki. Now, we've looked at three Cranbrook visitors. Aalto is this sort of specifically human or natural organic architect that was in opposition to and in advancement of Corbusian modernism, which asserted the sort of inhuman machine-made nature of architecture. But Aalto thought of Frank Lloyd Wright that while his buildings might not be rationalist in the ordinary sense of the term, they instead contain a mystic element and reflect a remarkable quest for decorative values. But here, Frank Lloyd Wright has been proven right. For Wright's buildings seek a form of society in which the present day antithesis can be juxtaposed and brought into harmony. So you see that I hope I've presented this sort of cross-cultural connection that linked these three men who came and spoke to the Cranbrook students. I think of all of them, Aalto was probably most sympathetic to the sort of non-dogmatic nature of Cranbrook's experimental art community. We were not the Bauhaus, we were not revolutionaries. I think Le Corbusier would have been too extreme and Frank Lloyd Wright too idiosyncratic. So I've taken us up to where these men are in their careers as they spoke at Cranbrook, so in the 30s and 40s. Each of them will go on for another few decades to build buildings, whether that's Frank Lloyd Wright, whose career really skyrockets on from 1938 on with buildings like Florida Southern College, his own desert house, or the Guggenheim, completed in the year of his passing, or Le Corbusier, who finally gets to build some of his proposed tower houses, the unités, which are little cells for apartments in concrete, and Le Corbusier's own transformations by the horrors of World War II into becoming an almost sculptural architect and abandoning the machine in favor of these deeply personal poems in concrete. Aalto, though, who seemed to have the most confidence right out of the gate in what he was doing, he seems to develop the most continuously in one style of this humanist modernism. Each of these people had a deep impact on the history of American architecture. While I can't say for certain what they did at Cranbrook in every minute of their journey, or what exactly they told the architecture students, or what exactly the architecture students took from the lesson, I am certain that having them here in the early days of this unique art school was really sort of legitimizing to Cranbrook, fortifying to the architectural visitors, and I'm sure just terribly exciting to have these people coming through the brand new gates of this campus. If you have questions, Alyssa should open up the chat and you can type them in. Before, as you think about your question, I'll just whet your appetite for next Monday night when we will look at three architects of the 1960s who came to Cranbrook. Why are we jumping from 1930 to 1960? Well, Cranbrook in the 50s had lost Saarinen, it had lost Carl Millis, and in many respects, its architecture department had lost its way. And so we must get to the era of Glenn Paulson, when he invites the architects Minoru Yamasaki, Louis Kahn, and James Wines of Site Architects to come to Cranbrook and to lecture in this age of heroic high modernism and the beginnings of the postmodern, or the rejection of everything Le Corbusier stood for. If you have questions, I am happy to take them. You can unmute your camera and ask it directly. We'll spend about the next 11 minutes here with questions. And of course, if you have questions that you'd rather email, you can reach me at center@cranbrook.edu. Is that a question I hear? Nope, someone just unmuted. Oh, there we go.
Kevin, I have a question.
Yes.
Kevin, could you tell us a little more about the art school itself? Was architecture a subcategory? And were there other artists that came? Were the lectures important in the educational program?
Yes, great question, Lillian, good to see you. And you know, this week, these three titans, I really struggled with how to squeeze them into 75 minutes. So I wanted to focus on what these three visitors would have been like. Next week, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the architecture program at Cranbrook. And how it evolved from the 1930s to the 1960s. In short, Cranbrook was divided by departments that were arranged under single master artist and artisans. So Eliel Saarinen was the master architect who attracted students, not young students, not students right out of architecture school, but architects with experience who wanted to focus on specific problems. So we were not granting degrees. You didn't come for a 2-year course in architecture. You came for a 6-month or 3-year study with a mentor of Eliel Saarinen working on your own project. And it was fairly similar in the departments of painting and sculpture, weaving, ceramics, metalsmithing as well. They were generally professional students, or students with exceptional talent who were coming to perfect their craft in an environment of great collaboration and tutelage. Next question.
I have a question. Did Le Corbusier only build residential, or did he build commercial?
Well, I think from the kindness of Alvar Aalto, who is the absolutely most sympathetic character of the bunch. I mean, his love letters between him and Ino are truly moving. Le Corbusier didn't build a lot of buildings before 1937 because he was proposing these revolutionary structures. And so why would you trust someone who wanted to destroy the center of Paris with a commission for something like a skyscraper or a large building? Even more than that, I should say that he wasn't building bigger buildings, bigger things than houses, because France was in a deep economic recession because of World War I. So there was no money to build. So he was speculating these huge projects, but he was building these little houses for very wealthy people. That would change. So check out books about Le Corbusier, because he would build a lot of churches and towers and other projects, particularly after World War II.
Thank you.
Of course.
Kevin, I have one in the chat for you. Do you think that Cranbrook's contribution is more towards architecture and less towards craft?
That is a great question. So one of the running themes that I hope you noticed tonight was planning and town planning. And certainly the discourse in America in the 1930s was really focused on planning and the small house problem. And even more so in Europe, it was town planning, whether that was rebuilding from World War I, building for the sort of slums, getting rid of slums through planning. And so it's interesting that Eliel Saarinen, though we remember him as such a beautiful aesthetic architect, I mean, the buildings at Cranbrook are so exquisite as objects, he was actually much more interested in planning. And so there's not a lot of architects who come like out of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then they design Frank Lloyd Wright inspired buildings, are the Harvard box and all of the students of Walter Gropius at Harvard, like I.M. Pei and Paul Rudolph, who then build little Gropius buildings. Saarinen doesn't have sort of disciples in that way. He's creating more of he's A, focused on planning, and B, he's creating this atmosphere of collaboration. And so in that sense, I would say that the arts and crafts and the designers of Cranbrook are more influential, but a lot of them were architecture students. So people like Harry Weiss and Benjamin Baldwin and Charles Eames, who are architects, but because Eliel Saarinen was promoting this comprehensive understanding of architecture, from the teacup to the table to the room to the building to the city plan, the students then viewed architecture as necessitating them learning how to weave, learning how to throw pots. And so many of them became furniture makers and other designers, and that's what we know them for. And so the short answer is yes, Cranbrook is better known as a design school than an architecture school, but I think it goes directly to how Eliel Saarinen organized the school.
Do you know which town in England Cranbrook's architecture was specifically inspired by?
So Cranbrook's architecture is inspired by the English arts and crafts movement. And so Eliel Saarinen was a little bit less interested in English arts and crafts than George Booth was. And so Eliel Saarinen designs his most English style buildings at Cranbrook. The Finnish arts and crafts was more rough and tumble, more Finnish. And so Eliel Saarinen is not looking towards any specific site in England. If you have more questions, feel free to always ask anything, but I did last year's lecture series, which are free online. I did do a 5-week history of Cranbrook's own architecture and Eliel Saarinen's journey through the construction of Cranbrook. So there are specifically episodes 2 and 3 are focused on the building of Cranbrook. Linda, did you have a question? Or any other questions?
Me? Yeah. Maybe you're going to answer this in a subsequent lecture, but who were the architects that sort of sprung out of Cranbrook?
We will answer that in later questions. Again, today I had so much goodness to get through. I didn't want to get bogged down, but they will come up in future lectures because they come back to visit and to teach.
Kevin, have you seen the Friedenhausen Morris house in Lenox, Massachusetts? It's based on the Ovsenfont studio.
Yes, and we have some big news coming out of that house that will be announced shortly next month. So keep your eye on your email, everyone. It's a pretty amazing National Historic Landmark in Massachusetts that is America's greatest example of functionalist architecture, particularly because the nearby home of Walter Gropius, by the time Gropius builds Gropius House in 1937, he's looking at Alvar Aalto. And so Gropius House is indebted as much to Alvar Aalto as it is to the Bauhaus, versus the Friedländers House is really sort of pure European machine for living functionalism.
I worked with Kenny Friedenhauser to restore all the furniture, this great American Art Deco furniture.
Oh, amazing.
And it's really a great place to go and visit if you have a chance in the Berkshires.
Yes.
So Kevin?
Hi, Jim.
Yeah, hi. The Millard House. I'm not familiar with it. Is it still around?
Oh, yeah.
It is.
Yes. Oh, La Miniatura. It is. It's still a private residence. It's really quite small. And just like Falling Water, where the view of, this is the concrete block house in LA. Just like Falling Water, where the view of it is from this like very difficult to access woodland path, and you have to scale down the rocks to actually see the design of Falling Water as we see it in photos.
Right.
The view of La Miniatura, that's the view from a sort of swamp and wastewater plant on the other side, is sort of through a fence. And if you just go to the address with your GPS, you see nothing. Luckily, everything online says, oh, you have to wind around and look at the house from this opposite side.
Yeah, I've never seen that view. So it's still there.
It is. Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. Does it go by another name?
La Miniatura is the romantic name for it that Frank Lloyd Wright gave.
It's just down the canyon from the Gamble House.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Which canyon?
Pasadena.
No, it's not Pasadena Canyon.
I mean, it's in the city of Pasadena. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
And I've got one in the chat for you. Could you say more about Le Corbusier and how World War II shifted his totalitarian views? Was his building in Berlin you showed from the 50s in East or West Berlin?
Great question. Huge question on the political views of Le Corbusier. So if all of you who have libraries about architecture know that the literature on Frank Lloyd Wright is literally endless. Le Corbusier is pretty much the same thing. And so there are lots of books that talk about his theories and his politics and where exactly on the scale of sort of from Italian futurists to Russian constructivists to from totalitarian to communist to socialist. He's really all over the place. And he goes into exile during World War II, and then he comes back and he's sort of miffed that he doesn't get to rebuild more. And eventually he sort of gives up politics altogether in view of poetry, which is his sort of late career, which are all these sort of monuments to the poetics of concrete. His building in Berlin is part of a whole project in West Berlin, which was meant to be an update of that earlier show in Stuttgart from 1927, where all of the leading lights of European architecture built essentially social housing, worker housing. The same thing was true in West Berlin. So Alvar Aalto skyscraper that I briefly showed at the end is actually right next to Le Corbusier's Unité habitat. And what I love about the Berlin habitat house is that Le Corbusier sort of absorbing the critique that his architecture is not human friendly and is sort of, you know, cold. Well, if you actually read what he writes, it's all about light, air, nature, sunlight. It's all these things that should be humanistic. And so instead of actually changing his approach, he simply presses into the concrete, well, here's the figure of a man, and look how proportional my building is to man. And then Alvar Aalto goes the sort of opposite tact, which is, well, how about I actually put beautiful works of art? How about I make a building that is enjoyable to be in? I mean, clearly you see my opinion of Le Corbusier is not on par with Mr. Wright and Aalto. Other questions? So if you have other questions, you do feel free to email me. If any of you looking over the future architects, if any of you alumni of Cranbrook went to those lectures, also reach out to me. This morning I had someone reach out about her attendance to the Yamasaki lecture, and I learned a great deal from her. So, you know, if you have things to share, don't hesitate to reach out. My email is kadkison@cranbrook.edu. If you don't know how to spell my last name, center@cranbrook.edu. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at our first of the History of American Architecture Cranbrook Visitors Lecture Series. We are still selling tickets and we are recording these lectures. So if you know someone who would enjoy this, feel free to send them the link so that they can sign up, and we can happily send them the recording of tonight's lecture so they can catch up. If you yourself miss any in the future, do know that they'll be recorded and you can get those copies Thursday after the lecture. Thanks so much, everyone, and I will see you next Monday at 7 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.